Hello everyone, my name is Weije Oudwijn. I'm working at the Radboud University Medical Center in the Netherlands, and I'm also the president of HTI. And today I'm going to reflect with you on deliberative processes for health technology assessment and how that might improve decision making. I'm going to give you some background about why deliberation is important for health technology assessment. I will also provide you some theoretical background and also reflect on practical guidances that are under development or already being used. And taking that practical guidance, I also will provide you with some best practice examples from out the world. So if we look at the definition of health technology assessment, we can see that health technology assessment is meant to be informing decision-making. So the purpose is to inform decision-making in order to promote an equitable, efficient, and high-quality health system. The question, of course, is how does health technology assessment inform decision-making? And also, what does that mean? We all know that health systems around the globe need to set priorities for their reimbursement decisions, for how to design their health benefit package. And this is a complex and very value-laden political process. You might refer to the discussion that a lot of countries have about what is a fair price for a certain drug. And who you talk to might also have an influence on how this fair price is perceived. So it means that different stakeholders can have different values that they take into account when they think about a fair price, or also when they inform the decision-making around health benefit packages. So the question, of course, is how can we then inform decision-making in a very well-designed way? Well, here the concept of legitimacy comes into place, because legitimacy is how decisions are actually perceived by different stakeholders. So even though the evidence is quite clear, there might always be social values at stake in which the process could be reflected upon from a different perspective. So when you talk about the perspective of a patient, that could be completely different from, indeed, what a policymaker wants to achieve with spending on their health benefit package, right? So it is important to consider the different values that are underlying the different stakeholders' perspective when you make decisions. And therefore, stakeholder involvement is very important. Normally, when we talk about stakeholders, we always refer to the 7 Ps, which you can see here, also on the screen. And it's important to understand that these different stakeholders have different views on what is perceived value. And value is exactly what HTA can bring about. How to determine value, but also how to interpret value. So actually, the evidence that feeds into the decision-making process, or what we would call the formulation of recommendations, is actually appraised from a certain standpoint. And this should be very explicit and can also differ quite across different countries, because different countries have different value frameworks. And you all have been discussing about different value frameworks already 2 years ago, I think, during one of the former LATAM policy fora. And also that stakeholders can be involved in different phases of the HTA process, like last year when you talked about priority setting for health technology assessments. So legitimacy is the central concept, and what we mean by legitimacy is that fairness of coverage decisions, or decisions in general, are perceived by different stakeholders. So different stakeholders should perceive the process as fair, not necessarily all the criteria or the evidence that is collected on all the criteria that are taken into account. So it's mainly focusing on the process. So process and evidence together are important in HTA. So how can you then define legitimacy? So often legitimacy is defined by a set of conditions for a fair process. And that means that all relevant stakeholders should be included. This is often referred to inclusivity as a principle. That the process must be transparent, not only at the end of the decision making, but also from the beginning, when you define your decision criteria, or when you set your priorities, or when you collect your data. It's very important that all these processes are transparent. Another important aspect is that decisions should be or could be appealed against. So that's a very important point for legitimacy as well. And all these conditions must be regulated. These conditions are based on an ethical framework, a theoretical framework called the accountability for reasonableness. The question, of course, is how can we translate this into practical guidance? Because this is a theoretical framework and it's not quite clear how HTA bodies or those that are involved in HTA can work with these principles. The issue is that you could design your processes around stakeholder involvement, because inclusivity is one of the key concepts of the A4R. And also by involving stakeholders, you can improve your decision making. You could do that by identifying the full range of interests in a certain decision making process, but also by doing that, you can improve the understanding amongst stakeholders, so by involving them. And also improve the quality of the decisions by using stakeholders' knowledge. So asking them about their knowledge, their experience, their judgments that are reflected either in, for example, decision criteria or in how you would like to collect the data. It is actually to provide a shared understanding of what you are trying to achieve with a certain process. And also that these are then relevant and transparent and effective. And I think relevance is also very important here, because by leaving out important stakeholders, you might end up with decisions that are not relevant for certain populations, and therefore it might also affect the effectiveness of the decision making. For example, if you would leave out important patient relevant notions, for example, to determine the effectiveness of a drug, for example, whether or not a patient would like to have the drug oral or intravenous, it might lead to less uptake of a certain drug in the population, and therefore the effectiveness. So this is very important to understand, that the stakeholder involvement is key in when you do deliberation. So there are actually 3 ways of stakeholder involvement in HTA. What we see most often is stakeholder communication. It means that an HTA body or a certain organization just communicates or informs stakeholders about HTA results or about the process. And what I'm actually doing now is also communicating. So I'm actually providing one-way communication from me to you. And so there is no reflection from your side. So there's no open dialogue between the two of us. Another way of stakeholders involvement is what we call stakeholder consultation. You could do that by collecting feedback from stakeholders, by using, for example, surveys, or you could do an interview, or you could organize a focus group, or ask for written testimonies. Again, there is no open dialogue because it's often done from the perspective of the stakeholder. So the stakeholder gives feedback to me. For example, if you would I would ask you a question about how do you perceive this lecture, then you could say fine or not fine, or could be improved, for example. That would be from your way to me. So that's the other way around. But if we talk about deliberation, we always talk about participation. It means that there have to be two-way communication. So an active engagement and open exchange in argumentation and evidence. So here the evidence, so what HTA is aiming to collect, but also the argumentation, why it is important, or what are the underlying assumptions in collecting the evidence, is very important. So participation actually is deliberation, and it helps us, both of us, if we would do the deliberation, to really understand what we mean by certain aspects, and also to provide insights in potential differences of what we perceive as a relevant outcome measure, for example, but also how we might resolve certain differences between us. So this is very important. So how to make this happen? Well, there are some initiatives that try to translate the A4R principles, and in which stakeholder involvement is key, into practical guidance or practical principles that HTA bodies can use in practice. One practical guidance is the one my university is working on, and it's called Evidence-Informed Deliberative Processes, and it is mainly targeting health benefit package design. So it's based on the theoretical framework of the A4R, as well as on multi-criteria decision analysis. And what we have done is we developed practical steps alongside the HTA process. And we also analyzed the practices of different HTA bodies to see how that would work in practice. We also did a survey of members of the International Network of Agencies for Health Technology Assessment, INATA, as well as we worked with low and middle income experts. And we also applied this already in several countries. And this guidance is free available on this website that you can see here. And currently we are applying this practical guidance in Moldova, and helping them to set up an HTA process, specifically targeting health benefit package design to achieve universal healthcare coverage. But you can also see we also applied it in other middle income countries, as well as in high income countries. The underlying theoretical framework is indeed, like I said, the A4R, the Accountability for Reasonableness framework. We translated that into practical aspects of what we call evidence-informed deliberative processes, which is stakeholder involvement, about which I just talked, the evidence-informed evaluation, so that is mainly targeting the collection of evidence according to multi-criteria decision analysis, transparency, which is also an important aspect of the A4R, and appeal. And then we applied this into the decision-making process of HTA bodies. So these are the 6 steps that you can find in the guide. We always start with installing an advisory committee that formulates the recommendations to the policymakers, the decision-making criteria, selecting health technology assessment, health technologies for health technology assessment, then the assessment process itself and appraisal, communication, appeal, monitoring, and evaluation. And what you can see here is, and this is what I already talked about, is that stakeholder involvement or stakeholder participation is key in each of these 6 steps. So not only at the appraisal, what we are often hear. So when advisory committees make recommendations, but already by thinking about, for example, how your advisory committee is formed, but also how decision criteria are defined and whether or not they are based on the social values that are underlying a health system, for example. So here, for example, the public is a very important stakeholder. What you can find in the guide are examples, and here you can see examples from Canada, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, which is the national HTA agency. France, we looked at the HAS, so the Haute Autorité Santé, the national agency in France. In England, we looked at NICE, well known to you, I guess. In Australia, we looked at the PBAC, so for the pharmaceutical benefit package, and we looked at the Scottish Medicines Consortium for Scotland. We also included middle income countries. I did not provide that on this slide because you are going to talk about that also during your meeting during the coming days. But here you can see that we looked at the size of a committee, and you can already see that different committees have different sizes, and also the composition, whether or not stakeholders are involved and how they are involved. For example, here you can see that most of them do include consumer or public representatives, and also patient representatives are involved in the advisory committee of each of these HTA bodies, and also whether or not it's an advisory committee, or whether the recommendation are binding, and how they come to the recommendation, whether they use a majority of votes or consensus. So here you can see also that the way in which stakeholders are involved, or how deliberation takes place, differs. And this is fine because it's very context dependent. It depends on the mandate of an agency. It also depends on whether or not certain aspects are written in law, for example. That's also important, but also how a certain HTA agency or the country perceives decision making, whether or not majority of vote is the leading principle, or, for example, consensus. So when you want to introduce deliberative processes, it's very important, again, like with HTA in general, to look at the decision-making process. This is another example about transparency, actually. So the translation of the transparency principle is here at stake. So we looked at whether or not the meetings of these appraisal committees are open or closed. So if it's open, you would imagine it more transparent decision-making, and therefore also more improved decision-making. So the quality of the recommendations could be better if there is full scrutiny of how the process went. So here you can actually see that a lot of countries do not have that yet. Some of them have a mixed model. That means that some meetings are held in public, while others are only discussed during closed meetings. For example, I did not include the Netherlands here, but in the Netherlands, the meetings are open. So it means that even the public can attend the meetings of our advisory committee or appraisal committee, and it's fully disclosed. The minutes are fully disclosed also on the website. So here again, you can see that not every country is ready to have full disclosure of their meetings. And of course, we would say that in this case, they do not adhere completely to what we perceive best practice for a deliberative process. Also, you can see whether or not external stakeholders are allowed, and who is, for example, approving the attendance of certain stakeholders. So this is also very important to understand. So how are decisions made, or the recommendations made, who are involved, what was the process. So we focus mainly with deliberation about the process and whether or not there has been an open exchange of arguments and evidence, and also in order to see if certain evidence has been taken into account or not, or even if certain evidence has been missed completely by not involving stakeholders. Another important initiative which focused mainly on drug reimbursement recommendations is at the Global Policy Forum discussion that was held in 2020. So I guess you are all familiar with the Global Policy Forum. It's large, also reflecting a lot of countries and a lot of non-for-profit and for-profit organizations. And during that meeting, we discussed principles and supporting actions for deliberative processes, specifically indeed for drug reimbursement recommendations. So here you can see that the focus was mainly on the appraisal part, although of course we also touched upon the evidence that feed into the deliberation as well as the outputs. The outcomes of this exercise have been published in the International Journal, and I also know that the background paper reflects on this and includes this reference. So if you want to hear more about it, you can read this. But actually what was done during that meeting was to see what the Global Policy Forum members perceived to be the guiding principles for drug reimbursement recommendations. So they did 3 rounds consensus or Delphi process, and eventually we came up with 3 guiding principles: transparency, impartiality, and inclusivity. And you can see that transparency and inclusivity are also reflected upon in the A4R framework, so what I just presented upon. Impartiality was felt to be a very important additional principle, and that has to do with disclosing conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest throughout the deliberation. So not only during the deliberation, but also the formation of, for example, committee, whether or not whether or not there is any undue influence in the whole process. So this was felt to be very important. I will come back to these principles in a minute, because there is another initiative that actually builds upon the work of the Global Policy Forum. After the Global Policy Forum, HDI and ISPOR joined forces to come up with guidance for deliberative processes for HTA throughout the whole HTA process. So here you can find more information if you want. Here I refer to the website, but I will give you some insights in what we are currently doing. So the need for guidance was felt, like also what we are doing with the EDP guide, so the evidence-informed deliberative process, where we focus mainly on health benefit package design. Also, the Global Policy Forum, as well as ISPOR, identified the need for clear guidance throughout the HTA process. So not necessarily only for defining benefit package recommendations, but also for how to set up an HTA agency, for example. So what are the underlying principles that a certain country or region wants to adhere to when they set up an HTA agency? That's also part of deliberation. So I will give you now a few slides about how the task force was formed, and also what we are currently working on, because this will be published hopefully by the end of this year, and otherwise early next year, because we are in the final phase. So it's a collaboration between HDI and ISPOR. It was actually designed by my co-lead Don Hussereau and myself. we made a proposal for how this guidance could look like, and that was approved by both HDI and ISPOR Board of Directors already 2 years ago, almost 1.5 years ago. And we invited 13 other task force members based on their backgrounds, not only in HTA, but for example, also in policy sciences, in ethics, also people with practical experience working for HTA agencies, for example, as well as also people in low and middle income countries, because we wanted to have the broad spectrum of HTA processes, as well as also the context in which deliberative processes are applied. We also included different stakeholders, so we also have a representative from a patient organization, from the European Patient Federation, also industry representative, and also health professionals, as well as HTA agencies. So there are several stakeholders involved. So what is the intended audience and scope of the guidance? So we developed guidance for those who wish to use deliberation for, like I said, developing the governance and structure of an HTA program or an HTA body, or those that wish to optimize their HTA processes as such. So, for example, several HTA bodies, not all of them, but there could also be HTA organizations that focus on the different steps or the different activities related to HTA. So, for example, horizon scanning activities or priority setting, also providing scientific advice, not regulatory, because that's at the remit of the regulatory agency, but there are agencies that also provide scientific advice. The scoping, assessment, and the synthesis of relevant information, so mainly the assessment itself, the contextualization, by which we mean the appraisal or appraising the evidence in broader context, the communication of the outcomes of the deliberation, and then very important and most often forgotten, the monitoring and evaluation of the whole process. So this is very important to understand, that we try to come up with broad guidance for all of these different stages, as well as for the structure of an HTA program. Of course, several countries and several HTA agencies already have partly the deliberative aspects in their processes. So it's also meant to be for those who wish to complete or make their deliberative process more in line with the accountability for reasonableness framework. Like I said, some of the countries do not have an open meeting, and for them it could also work as a reflection. And I'm happy to tell you that several countries already are now trying to use this guidance that we developed. For example, we presented this during an HTA panel and an ISPOR panel, in which we invited HTA agencies and asked them whether or not they felt the guidance was practical and valuable for optimizing their processes. And for example, the Netherlands felt that it was very helpful, but also HTA body from Tunisia felt it was very important for low and middle income countries to use this in order to optimize their process. So during the throughout the guidance, we also provide real-world examples. These examples have been verified by the people involved. This one is about identification and prioritization of relevant topics for HTA, and most of you already have learned about that last year during the last Latin America Policy Forum. This one is focusing on Thailand. We also have people from the HTA agency in Thailand included in our task force, and they also made this example available. So here you can see mainly about how stakeholders are involved, which stakeholders are involved and how they are involved, and how they do the deliberation in order to come up with priorities for HTA in their process. Another example is NICE, and I do know that there will be another plenary speaker about speaking about NICE itself. So I hope Pilar will speak about the scientific advice. If not, this is an example that we have included in the in our guidance. It is about how NICE works with patients and carers, as well as health economic experts as stakeholders, to come up with scientific advice to industry. So this is also an example that we have verified with the people involved. So this is another example that could give you some insights in how you could structure deliberation in the different phases of an HTA process. The issue, however, is that it was very hard to find truly deliberative processes throughout the world, from agencies throughout the world, because most of the HTA bodies, or those that are using HTA, are still using stakeholder consultation as the guiding principle for their processes. And that's, we just said, for us, that is not truly deliberative, and therefore we did not take those into account. But of course, we fully understand that that might be a stepping stone, and in some cases, consultation is already the best thing to do before you can even think about deliberation. So what does the guidance look like? Actually, we have 6 sections in the guidance that is also translated into a practical checklist. Actually, we define guidance on how to design, but also how to implement a deliberative process. So we have guidance on the need for a deliberative process, how to prepare for a deliberative process, how to conduct the deliberative process, what kind of supporting activities are needed to implement the deliberative process, the development and the communication of the outputs, and the monitoring and evaluation. So I quickly go through these steps to give you some flavor. If you wish, you can also find the draft guidance on the web, because we just finalized a consultation, both from ISPOR side as well as HCI side. So that is the draft guidance. It will be updated, but the checklist is still the guiding principle. Also, the guidance is felt to be very helpful. Of course, there are some nuances that we need to update, but overall, the guidance will stay as it is, as we have seen from the comments that we kindly received from several reviewers. So determining the need for a deliberative process, the questions that we have put in the checklist are: why deliberate? What are desired outcomes of a deliberative process, and what is the scope? And by scope, we mean, do you focus on a certain stage of the HTA process, or do you want to set up an HTA program in your region or country or jurisdiction? So these are the bullet points that you can see here. I'm not going to talk to you to list them all. You can read them, but these are reasons why certain organizations might want to do deliberation. So it can, for example, be to enhance public trust. It can also be to improve the perceived legitimacy of the process. But it can also be to optimize the process, like I said before, if you already have certain processes in place. Another important point is the outcome. So why are you, I mean, not why, but what do you want to achieve with the deliberation? Most often, what we see indeed in the appraisal is to reach common ground, because you want to come up with a certain recommendation. But it can also be to have better mutual respect and understanding among participants. That could also be in one of the processes that you already have. So, or a mix of all of these. So These are options that we describe in the guidance in more detail, but in the checklist you can just see how it is structured. So when you prepare a deliberative process, it's very important to think about the contextual factors. I already gave a few examples, like sometimes there is law in place that you have to take into account when you want to set up a certain process. Also the mandate given to the organization. So for example, what is the remit of the HTA agency? Is it to give an advisory recommendation, or is it a binding recommendation? Can influence how you might structure your deliberative process. Also internal factors, very important. These are not only related to deliberation, but also how you do assessment, for example. So these are quite common things that you see in the HTA process. So how much money is allocated for HTA? Is there any data available at the local level? Do you have stakeholders that you are able to involve? For example, in certain countries, patient organizations are not organized at all. So how can you then reach out to them, even if you want to? And very important, of course, also the capacity to conduct and communicate deliberation, because this is also a certain process that you have to budget for, because it will take some time to set it up, but it eventually will improve your decision making. Like I said, the transparency, impartiality and inclusivity are very important principles that came out of the Global Policy Forum discussion. So it is important to understand what are the guiding principles that you want to adhere to when you design your deliberative processes. So do you want to adhere to transparency, impartiality, inclusivity, or might there be others, like you want to have an appeal process in place? That's very important to take into consideration. Also, what should be documented and communicated to the public, because you are accountable. I mean, often the organization is accountable to the public, or at least when it's publicly funded, it is accountable to the public. So you have to think about this as well. It is about writing, for example, terms of reference, what is included in setting up the deliberative process. How to conduct a deliberative process. These are aspects also related to how you, for example, do deliberation in an advisory committee. So who is deliberating, what membership arrangements enable effective deliberation? For example, is there a chairman in place? What is the role of the chairman, for example? How will participants be selected? And here you can see, for example, this is also very important. I mean, participants here are committee members, but also the other stakeholders that might have a stake in deliberation. And what is their role? Are they only communicating certain aspects to the deliberation in which a committee is deliberating, or do they actually actively engage in terms of participation? So this is also very important. Here you can also see that we have included the conflict of interest, so the impartiality part. So how will participants' identities be disclosed, and also whether or not they have a conflict of interest at all when they deliberate. So the rules of deliberation is also important. This can come back to, for example, do you adhere to a majority of votes, or do you want to adhere to consensus, for example? These are all things that you can consider or must consider in order to set up a deliberative process. The supports are also very important because, for example, how will information be presented? So is this information that feeds into a deliberation understandable for all stakeholders involved? Is it technical, or is it, for example, those that have not a technical background also understandable? Are participants Do they get any remuneration or not? Do they get any training, for example, in order to understand how deliberation should take place? Are there any templates available for those that wish to provide information? That's also very important to think about when you design your deliberative process. Then the communication and of the outputs of the deliberation, that's very important. So also whether or not there is an appeal procedure in place, this is exactly what it's referring to. Is deliberation be reconsidered, yes or no? If not, why not? This is also very important to understand. And also how you communicate the final outputs. Is this done publicly, or will certain aspects be confidential, yes or no? So to think about this also again in terms of the principles of transparency and indeed about appeal, for example. So this is also an aspect that you should take into account when you set up your deliberation. And finally, the monitoring and evaluation of a deliberative process is often forgotten, but it's very important, because by doing this, you can also clearly show that deliberation has made an impact on how the quality of the decision-making has improved. So these are questions that we ask and which we also give guidance. For example, is the desired change from implementing a deliberative process established, and does it align with the health system values or the principles established? So is there alignment between the whole process? How will the desired change from implementing a deliberative process be measured? So think about this. How can it be assessed? We also give examples of indicators in our guidance for that, and also how they will be used to evaluate the process. You can focus on the process itself, but you can also focus on outcome measures. So this is in a nutshell, and I know it's quite a lot of information about how you can set up a deliberative process according to the aspects of legitimacy, because ultimately we want to improve decision making, and this can be done. It might take some time, but I think it's worth the investment, and a lot of HTA agencies around the globe are truly believing in this, and they already started to work on this. For example, they also now currently are reviewing their processes, like the Canadian agency. They have recently reviewed their processes and are now updating their process in terms of increasing more legitimacy by involving stakeholders and also adhering to the framework of the accountability for reasonableness. And like I said, the Netherlands is also really working hard on reviewing their process, and also want to align actually the whole process, not only from the deliberation part, but they want to align that more clearly with also the identification of topics, also the evidence collection and the scientific evaluation of the evidence that feeds into the deliberation. So in that sense, I think it clearly shows that this is a hot topic, and I wish you a very interesting discussion during the coming 3 days, and I'm pretty sure you will come up with some practical guidance for your region. So thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you.